Hey guys, we are going to continue today with our focus on the lives of enslaved people. And I got two vocab words I want to start out with. One of them is antebellum. Antebellum refers to the period before the Civil War. So, oftentimes like 30 to 50 years leading up to the Civil War, which started in 1860. That is the antebellum period, and typically it's associated with the idea of slavery. So like once slavery is at its height in America, right, in those years leading up to the Civil War, we call that the antebellum period. Okay. Another term worth knowing is plantation. That is a large farm on which a valuable crop is grown. The ones we'll be studying, like cotton and tobacco, is what you're going to hear about most. Coffee and sugar were common ones as well. And so in terms of connection to slavery, the enslaved people would often be working on a plantation. So that's when you're going to hear the term plantation. Okay. So that's vocab for the day. I do have a stop and jot I want us to also start out with to refresh our minds. So remember yesterday I talked about 3 areas of an enslaved person's life that we were going to look at. Go ahead and pause the video, and in your social studies notebook, try to jot down what those 3 areas are. Okay, go ahead and do that now. Okay. I'm going to assume that you guys jotted that down, and hopefully you guys remembered the 3 areas: work, housing, and family life. All right. So just kind of very quick recap. Remember work, some of those facts. Many enslaved people had to work 18-hour days, oftentimes in the field, picking cotton, doing all those other processes by hand. Watched by an overseer the whole time and whipped for punishment. Housing, recall just the sort of shabby conditions of those houses, sometimes with no flooring, so it's just a dirt floor, poorly fed, all that stuff. And there's more, of course, we covered yesterday. Today we're going to focus on family life, and I'm going to start with a clip again. And again, guys, this is not going to be pleasant to watch. This is a reenactment of a slave auction. So the production value is kind of stripped down. But, even still, it's very unpleasant. It's painful what we're going to watch here. So again, if you want to skip this, I understand. But again, the reason I'm showing it is that just when you see it visualized, I think it just helps you see really what it was like and have just a better understanding, as much as we can have, of what it might have been like. All right, I'm going to go and play the clip.
Because enslaved people were viewed as property, they could be sold away from their families at any time. Many were sold at auctions. Auctions were advertised with posters to let people know the ship packed with enslaved people was about to arrive. At the auction, enslaved people would be forced to stand on a raised platform so they could be seen by the buyers. The buyer who bid the most money would then own the enslaved person. It was at the auctions where African families were split apart. Husbands, wives, and children went to different owners. Many never saw each other again. No event was more traumatic in the lives of enslaved people than the forcible separation from their families.
And so, again, guys, it sucks that we're confronted with this awful stuff kind of each day in this unit, but this is the topic we're studying, and that's the reality of what was happening. So you're watching a reenactment of literally somebody's child being pulled from their grasp and taken from them. And for many enslaved people, they may never see that child again. So yeah, I mean, really, really awful stuff. Let me go back to the notes and just cover then some more of the facts related to that. So first of all, for family life, most enslaved people couldn't get married without their slaveholders' permission. So, some slaveholders gave, their enslaved people and gave them permission, and so they would get married sometimes. But just even the fact that you had to get permission, right, very frustrating. We just saw in that clip there a reenactment of the fact that enslaved people could be sold away from their family, husbands and wives, parents and their children, siblings, that kind of stuff. Other things, selling, splitting apart families was sometimes used as a threat of punishment and a way to force enslaved people to do certain things. If they got reluctant to do something, they might threaten that. But another fact is that enslaved families did oftentimes develop strong family and community bonds. So if your family did stay together or part of it, oftentimes those family bonds were very deep. And community bonds too, because if you were separated, then the other enslaved people you're around became sort of a second family oftentimes, and those bonds with them became very important and very deep. So that's just a few facts on what family life was like. There's more to it than that, but that's some of the big stuff I want to cover. So I'm going to pull up yesterday's assignment just to kind of refresh you guys on the fact that you guys read a primary source document written by Josiah Henson, who, when he wrote it, he was a formerly enslaved individual from that time period. And I'm not going to reread the whole text because you read it yesterday, but I want to review the skills, and hopefully you guys remember that information well enough that this will make sense. It should make sense because I'm going to put examples up there. So here's one thing right off the bat is that thinking about key details, okay? I have two examples there. One of those is an example of a key detail. Go ahead and pause the video and jot in your social studies notebook which one is a key detail, number 1 or number 2. Go and do that now. Okay, so hopefully we put number 2, okay? And the reason is a couple reasons. Number 2, first of all, it's a specific fact that you saw from the primary source, right? A key detail is specific. So that fact you learned was that Josiah Henson and his family had no floor in the house that they lived in. The first one is really more of like a main idea, right? It's more of a statement about something you learned, not a very specific fact from the primary source itself. Now, as I'll show later, as a main idea, it's not the best main idea you could have. It certainly is true, but it actually is almost too general. But I'll get into that a little later in the video, that the trick about a main idea is you want to be more general than a key detail, but specific enough to really show what you learned. But for the purposes of this part of the video, just kind of know that that's not a specific detail from the primary source. It's just a general statement of something you learned from looking at the whole text itself, okay? So that is just a refresher on how to find key details. They are specific facts, aspects, things that you pulled out from the text, okay? So when I did the assignment myself, I think I pulled out like 8 or 9 in this one. There was a lot of details you could find. I just put 4 examples here because we're going to use this for looking at the main idea again. So Josiah Henson and his family wore toe cloth, which is a heavy, rough fabric. They got a new wool hat once every 2 to 3 years and a new pair of shoes once a year. And then 10 to 12 people had to oftentimes sleep in the same room. And wind, rain, and snow would oftentimes blow through the cracks in the houses that enslaved people lived in, okay? So what I want us to practice is, if those are your 4 key details, like, again, how do we come up with one main idea that summarizes a statement that we learned about enslaved people's lives based on those details? And I have, again, this time I have 3 examples, and I want you to decide which one is the best main idea that can kind of sum up those 4 key details. All right, number 1, enslaved people had to live in bad houses. Number 2, enslaved people had poor housing conditions and were provided with uncomfortable clothes. Number 3, enslaved people lived hard lives. Go ahead and pause and put down number 1, number 2, or number 3 in your social studies notebook. Okay, The best answer here is the second option. All right, and I'll explain because, first of all, let's look at number 3. So number 3 is, it's not like a totally bad idea. Again, I think those details do show that enslaved people lived hard lives. So it meets some of our expectations for a main idea. It is a statement of something that primary source shows about enslaved people's lives. It's general enough to be a main idea. But this is the tricky part. I think we can be a little more specific. So there is such a thing as being too general with your main idea, because you could say that almost anything written about slavery shows that enslaved people lived hard lives. I'm asking you, what did this primary source teach you? Okay, and so we can get a little bit more specific. Now, number 1 is better because it says enslaved people had to live in bad houses, poor housing. And that is a more direct, specific idea for what this text showed. But even still, if we look at the 4 details that I pulled out, 2 of them have to do with housing, right? So that still isn't really a good summary of all the key details that I found. So if you look at number 2, it says enslaved people had poor housing conditions and were provided with uncomfortable clothes. That's a nice statement that summarizes all 4 of these key details, because 2 of the details were about the shabby housing, but the other 2 details was about the poor quality of clothing that they were given, okay? So again, your main idea, that's the tricky part, is that you have to be more general and state what is something I learned about enslaved people's lives from this primary source, but try to be specific enough that you're really getting to the heart of what that particular text focused on. And this particular text was showing the poor housing and the poor clothing. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, you can always send me a message and ask questions and get help. But that's what you're going to do, again, with your assignment today. But again, you're going to have a new source and a new focus. This focus is going to be on married life, family life in general, but especially it's going to be about married life. So read that background. That's going to set you up for what this text is about. Then you'll want to read the text. And then at the end, just do the same thing that you did yesterday, with the biggest focus on being able to identify 3 to 4 specific key details and then summing it up into a single main idea that shows what you learned about enslaved people's lives from that text. Okay? And again, I do have a video of me reading that primary source aloud. If that is helpful to you, you can go and check that video out and watch that as well. All right, I don't have anything else for this video, so good luck, and I will be seeing you guys tomorrow. Take care.